I'd been standing on the hull and quarterdeck for about 5 minutes when a young yeoman walked up with a clipboard in his hand. He requested to see my orders. I handed him over. He checked off something and then asked me to follow him up to the O1 level, down the passageway, to the office of my immediate boss, Captain Stewart. Don't say it to his face, Sunshine Murray, Commanding Officer, Submarine Division 15. I recognized the name immediately. Back in 34, I'd been a young JG checking into the engineering course at Groton. Back then, it had been Commander Murray, the school's XO, and the name Sunshine was a misnomer. A local joke amongst the students was free drinks at the O Club for the duration if anyone had actually seen him smile. The yeoman opened the hatch and I stepped into the compartment. It was medium-sized and it was hot. There were 2 open portholes on the starboard side. Most of the space was taken up by a steel conference table. There were 6 officers sitting around it. In the corner was a large, unbalanced floor fan, doing a not-so-good job of trying to move the air. At the head of the table sat Captain Murray. It had only been 7 years since I'd seen him last, but he looked like he'd aged 100. He was tired and his hair was white. Behind him, covering the bulkhead, was a large curtain. When he saw me, he jumped up, came across the room, stuck out his hand, and smiled. As I shook it, I was thinking, man, there was a time when I could have got a lot of booze for this. He introduced me to the men in the room. They were the skippers of the other division boats. He asked me to take a seat. Then he went to the head of the room and pulled back the curtain, and I could tell why his hair was white. On the wall was a large map of the Pacific. It was covered with arrows, flags, and markers. It showed the current war situation. And what the situation was bad. After Pearl, the Japanese had bombed Midway, Wake, and Guam on their way home. In the Central Pacific, they were moving southeast, out of Kwajalein towards the Gilbert Islands. They had taken French Indochina and were attacking the Brits at Hong Kong. To the southwest, they were marching down the Malay Peninsula towards British Singapore. Closer to home, enemy aircraft from Formosa had bombed Clark and Aba fields, taking out most of our B-17s and fighters. The only bright spot on the map was the Brits. They'd sent out the battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse to help out, and boy did we need it. The Asiatic fleet wasn't much of a fleet. Heavy cruiser Houston, light cruiser Marblehead, some flush-deck destroyers, and a handful of submarines. Some of those built back during World War I. Not much to go to war with, but you don't go to war with what you want. You go to war with what you have. And what we have isn't much. As the meeting was winding down, there was a knock on the hatch. An ensign came in and handed the captain a piece of paper, and he went to the front of the room and put 4 red pins in the map east of Formosa. The captain looked at the message and handed it to the officer to his right, indicating he should pass it down. Each officer looked at it and handed it to the next. I was the last one to get it. It was a teletype message from the Army. Aircraft out of Nichols Field had spotted large groups of Japanese vessels heading southwest off the east coast of Formosa. A large part of the force contained transports, which meant one thing: invasion. Another sailor came in and gave each officer a sealed envelope. These were our patrol orders. The captain said not to open them till we were well out to sea. With that, the meeting broke up. As I stepped out, I saw the sailor that had brought me up from the quarterdeck. He was at the end of the passageway standing next to a sandy-haired lieutenant. He pointed at me and said something and stepped back into his office. As the man came down the hall, he stuck out his hand and introduced himself. Lieutenant Ambrewster, James R., from New Orleans, Louisiana. He was my XO. His uniform was cleaned and pressed, but you could see old grease and oil stains on it, and he had that same tired look in his eyes that everybody else had. It was obvious this man hadn't slept much in the last few days. He'd come aboard the Holland to make arrangements to top off the boat and to fetch me. We had orders to cross the harbor and meet up with the oiler Pecos. We went down to the quarterdeck, saluted the colors, and stepped over the side into the messenger boat. My gear was still aboard. With that, we shoved off and headed across the harbor. It was time to meet my new command.